Elena Whitman had always believed life was predictable. For 45 years, she had dedicated herself to teaching, to the rhythm of chalk on blackboards, and to the small comforts of her Upper East Side apartment. Her husband, Martin, had been the opposite, dapper, confident, charming, and, she thought, devoted. He had promised a secure retirement, quiet evenings, and a comfortable life together once they left the chaos of Manhattan classrooms behind. She never questioned Martin. Why would she? He played the role of the perfect husband to perfection. His golf outings every Thursday, she had assumed, were harmless, a hobby to blow off steam. Sometimes she had wished he would invite her along, but he always declined, saying it was a gentleman's thing. She never imagined these outings were the gateway to something darker. It all began on a gray November morning. Martin, 67, had complained of chest pains the night before but refused to go to the doctor, insisting it was just indigestion. Elena had left him sleeping and went to the kitchen for coffee, humming softly. The phone call came at 7:42 a.m. Martin had suffered a massive heart attack at his club. Dead before the paramedics could arrive. Grief washed over her like a tide. Elena spent the first days in a daze, fielding condolences from friends and colleagues, arranging funeral details, and trying to process the loss of the man she had loved for decades. It was during the cleaning of Martin's office that she discovered something that made her entire world tilt on its axis. The locked briefcase sat under his desk. She had never seen it before. Martin had always kept it hidden, even from her. Her fingers trembled as she picked the combination lock, a habit he had drilled into her once, decades ago, when they had joked about keeping secrets for security. Inside were folders, neatly labeled, investments, taxes, accounts. At first glance, it seemed like normal financial documentation, until she saw the Cayman Islands bank statements. Her stomach dropped. Thousands of dollars had been wired every week to offshore accounts she had never known existed. Retirement funds, her savings, and even money she had earmarked for her children's college funds had been secretly siphoned into risky cryptocurrency ventures. The spreadsheets revealed a dizzying pattern. Tens of millions had moved silently, cleverly hidden under layers of accounts and coded transactions. She felt her knees buckle. Her hands shook, clutching the papers that felt heavier than any weight she had ever carried. Taxes, audits, potential fraud investigations, her once planned life of quiet retirement was now a battlefield. Her son, David, a cautious and principled lawyer, saw the papers and immediately urged Elena to take action. "Mom, this isn't just a mistake. The bank enabled him to funnel money illegally. They have to be held accountable." Her daughter, Isabel, was less supportive. "Mom, you can't just make this public," Isabel snapped one evening, pacing the apartment. "It will destroy Dad's legacy. The family name. People will judge us for the rest of our lives." Elena looked at her daughter and realized that grief and loyalty had blinded some to the truth. "No, Isabel. This isn't about legacy. It's about fairness, about ensuring no one else is cheated because of someone else's greed. I won't hide because it's uncomfortable." Thus began Elena's crusade. With David by her side, she filed a lawsuit against the private bank that had facilitated the offshore accounts. Her initial public statements were cautious, measured. She wasn't seeking fame, just accountability. But the media picked up on the story. The New York Times called her the widow fighting Wall Street secrecy, and the financial news networks buzzed with intrigue. Her podcast, Widows and Wealth, began as a tool to educate herself about finances, taxes, and investing, but quickly evolved into a platform helping other widows navigate hidden financial dangers. Elena invited experts, financial advisors, former IRS agents, and even forensic accountants to provide tips on uncovering hidden assets, protecting retirement savings, and understanding investment pitfalls in high society marriages. She learned to code, track cryptocurrency, and even discovered subtle signs of financial fraud she had once ignored, blinded by love and trust. Week by week, her podcast grew, eventually reaching thousands of listeners, many of whom were women in the same precarious position she had been, living in wealth but powerless because they didn't understand what was happening behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the lawsuit progressed slowly, as such cases often do. Depositions, subpoenas, and bank audits became a new reality. Elena endured endless scrutiny from journalists, the press, and even distant family members, some of whom were angry at her persistence. Yet, she persisted. Her quiet demeanor masked an iron will. David was her anchor. He reminded her that knowledge was power, that her voice mattered, and that the bank had a responsibility that it had failed to uphold. Isabel, over time, began to see the impact of her mother's actions. She witnessed the calls from widows thanking Elena for saving their life savings, the applause at financial literacy seminars, and the courtroom victories that slowly began to tilt the scales toward justice. Months later, after a grueling deposition and settlement negotiations, the bank agreed to a multi-million-dollar restitution package, along with an internal overhaul of its compliance policies. Elena and David ensured that a portion of the recovered funds went toward a trust for widows and single mothers, people like her, who could be preyed upon by systemic financial negligence. By the time the settlement was finalized, Elena had transformed. She was no longer just a retired schoolteacher. She had become a voice, a teacher in a new classroom, and a beacon for women everywhere. Her podcast became a movement, expanding into webinars, workshops, and eventually a book, Silent No More, Protecting Your Wealth in a World of Hidden Greed. It topped financial literacy charts and became required reading for many professional organizations. Elena often reflected on Martin, not with hatred, but with understanding. Some people were charming on the outside and reckless on the inside. But she had learned that trust had to be paired with vigilance, and that love did not require blindness. In quiet moments, sitting in the Upper East Side apartment she now managed entirely herself, Elena would look out at the Manhattan skyline. The city buzzed below, full of opportunity and risk. She smiled. She had survived betrayal, deceit, and loss, and had turned devastation into empowerment, both for herself and for countless others. For Elena, retirement had been stolen, but she had built something far greater, a legacy of knowledge, empowerment, and courage, one widow at a time, absolutely. Let's continue and expand Elena's story, moving deeper into her transformation, the challenges she faces, and how she turns tragedy into long-term empowerment. Elena's mornings became rituals of resilience. She no longer awoke in the fog of grief, but with purpose. By 6 a.m., she would brew strong coffee and review emails from listeners of Widows and Wealth, sometimes replying personally to women whose stories reminded her painfully of her own. There was Madeline, a widow from Connecticut whose husband had hidden six-figure debts, LaToya, a nurse from Atlanta whose late husband's retirement accounts had vanished into an offshore scheme, and Maria, a real estate investor in Miami who had discovered her husband had secretly liquidated her shares and sold her assets while she slept. Each story was a battle cry. Each woman a reflection of what Elena had once feared, that love and trust could blind even the most careful. Elena started creating guides, one-page checklists, and online courses that taught widows how to audit accounts, spot warning signs in financial statements, and confront institutions that hid behind layers of bureaucracy. But the challenges didn't stop. Weeks after her first podcast episode, Elena received a cryptic email. "Stop digging into this, or you'll regret it. Some things are better left buried." The sender was anonymous, but the implication was clear: the bank, and possibly other high society players implicated in Martin's offshore schemes, did not appreciate the exposure. For a moment, fear crept in, a whisper in the back of her mind. But it was quickly replaced by determination. She reminded herself of her father's words from childhood: courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite it. She hired a small cybersecurity team to secure her podcast emails, financial documents, and personal files. David, ever vigilant, insisted she avoid public appearances alone for a while. But Elena refused to cower. She scheduled a live webinar, inviting former financial regulators, forensic accountants, and whistleblowers who had once feared retaliation themselves. The event was streamed live to over 15,000 viewers. Elena spoke calmly, her voice steady, but her words carried the weight of experience. She explained how widows and women in high society marriages often became collateral damage in financial schemes. She broke down Martin's offshore accounts as a case study, not to shame him, but to teach others to avoid similar traps. Questions poured in through the chat: how can I check my spouse's accounts? What signs should I look for? Can I protect inheritance funds legally? Elena answered each one. By the end of the session, she realized something remarkable. She was no longer just a victim or a teacher, she was a leader. A movement had formed around her. Women began sharing their stories, supporting each other, and even raising funds to sue predatory banks. Local and national news outlets called her the widow who fought Wall Street. Meanwhile, Isabel, Elena's daughter, began to reconsider her initial opposition. Seeing the overwhelming support for her mother and the tangible impact she was creating forced Isabel to confront her own privilege and fear. When Elena invited her daughter to participate in a financial literacy seminar, Isabel hesitated but eventually agreed. She became a reluctant partner, helping with social media outreach, and eventually found her own voice advocating for transparency in family finances. The legal battle with the bank was grueling. Depositions stretched for months. Lawyers delayed and obfuscated, hoping Elena would grow weary. But she had learned patience from teaching decades of schoolchildren and from grieving Martin. Finally, the bank agreed to a settlement, but Elena made sure it wasn't just about the money. She required the institution to implement strict monitoring of client accounts, mandatory transparency reports, and educational outreach for clients. They also funded a scholarship fund for women in finance, a gesture Elena insisted be public. Her podcast evolved into a non-profit, Financially Fearless Women, dedicated to financial education, transparency, and advocacy for widows and women in vulnerable marriages. Elena traveled the country to speak at conferences, universities, and women's empowerment events, using her story as a blueprint for resilience. Years later, Elena sat in her apartment, overlooking the New York skyline. She reflected on how far she had come, from the quiet grief of a widow blindsided by betrayal, to the commanding presence of a mentor and leader. She had reclaimed her life, her voice, and her purpose. She smiled, remembering Martin not with bitterness, but with the clarity that comes from understanding human complexity, that love and betrayal can coexist, but courage and wisdom can transform pain into power. Elena poured a cup of tea, looked at her notes for the next podcast episode, and whispered, "We're just getting started." Months turned into years. Elena's nonprofit, Financially Fearless Women, became a recognized force in advocating for financial transparency and widows' rights. Former clients she had helped became her closest allies, women who had once felt powerless now spoke at conferences alongside her, mentoring others. The bank settlement had long concluded, and Elena had used a portion of the recovered funds to create scholarships for women in finance and to fund community workshops. The IRS audits, once terrifying, had been resolved thanks to her meticulous records and the guidance of David. She had emerged stronger, smarter, and far more confident than she ever imagined. One crisp morning, Elena walked through her Manhattan neighborhood, coffee in hand, passing the streets she had once traversed in quiet grief. She stopped at a small bookstore where a poster advertised her book, Silent No More, Protecting Your Wealth in a World of Hidden Greed. The line of women waiting to get copies stretched down the block. She smiled. For the first time since Martin's death, she felt peace. She had turned betrayal into purpose, heartbreak into empowerment, and fear into knowledge. In the evening, as the city lights twinkled beneath her apartment window, Elena reflected on her journey. She had been a widow blindsided by greed, a mother navigating family conflict, and a teacher who suddenly needed to educate the world. But through it all, she had learned one invaluable lesson: courage isn't just surviving, it's transforming pain into strength that others can follow. Elena poured herself a cup of tea, opened her laptop, and began drafting her next podcast episode. She would continue teaching, guiding, and empowering. Because now, she was no longer just surviving in a world of hidden secrets. She was leading. And this time, no one could take that away from her.